there is a primal fear attached to the forest. When we are in the city, we feel like the dominant species, but when you step into the deep woods, surrounded by miles of silence and darkness, you realize very quickly that you are not in charge. You are just a visitor, and sometimes you are prey. Here are 3 true scary stories from the woods. I've always preferred hiking alone. There is a specific kind of peace you can only find when you are miles away from cell service, detached from the noise of modern society. Last October, I decided to take a trip to a national forest in northern Minnesota. I wasn't planning on staying at a designated campsite. My plan was to hike about 8 miles in, set up a dispersed camp off the main trail, and spend 2 nights in total isolation. The hike in was beautiful. The autumn leaves were turning deep shades of red and orange, and the air was crisp. I reached my target area around 4 p.m. It was a small clearing near a dried-up creek bed, completely hidden from the main trail by thick brush. I set up my tent, organized my gear, and sat down to eat a cold dinner as the sun began to dip below the tree line. That was when the silence changed. In the woods, silence is rarely absolute. There is usually the sound of wind, birds, or squirrels moving through the undergrowth. But as the twilight turned to dusk, the forest became dead silent. It felt as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I remember feeling a sudden irrational urge to put out my small fire. My instincts were screaming at me that I was too visible, that the light was a beacon inviting something unwanted. I stomped out the embers and retreated into my tent. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring up at the nylon roof, listening. Around 1 a.m. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were not the frantic, scurrying sounds of an animal. They were heavy, rhythmic, and deliberate. 2 legs. Someone was walking through the dry leaves, circling my campsite. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was terrified the intruder would hear it. The footsteps were slow, pausing every few yards. It sounded like someone was examining my setup, looking for something. The footsteps stopped right behind my tent. I lay perfectly still, clutching my hiking knife, waiting for the sound of the zipper being pulled down. But nothing happened. There was no voice, no attempt to enter. Just the sound of heavy, wet breathing right against the fabric of the tent, inches from my head. I laid there for what felt like hours, paralyzed by fear, until eventually the footsteps slowly walked away into the darkness. When the sun finally rose, I didn't wait to make breakfast. I packed my gear with frantic speed, desperate to get back to the trail. As I was pulling up the stakes of my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Surrounding my tent, arranged in a perfect circle about 10 feet out, were small piles of stones. They hadn't been there when I set up camp. Someone had spent the night silently building a perimeter around me while I slept. I grabbed my pack and started hiking back toward the main trail, moving much faster than I had the day before. About 2 miles into the hike, I got the sensation that I was being followed. I stopped and looked back, but saw nothing but dense trees. I kept moving. A mile later, I saw it. About 50 yards off the trail to my left, standing perfectly still behind a large oak tree, was a figure wearing dirty, earth-toned clothing. They weren't hiking. They were just standing there, watching me. I didn't stop to confront them. I didn't shout. I gripped my knife and broke into a run. I ran for nearly 3 miles until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot where my car was waiting. I threw my gear in the trunk and drove away, constantly checking my rearview mirror. When I got home and unpacked my bag, I found one last terrifying detail, tucked into the side pocket of my backpack. A pocket I hadn't opened since I left my house, was a small, smooth stone, identical to the ones that had been piled around my tent. At some point during my hike out, the person watching me had gotten close enough to slip it into my bag without me feeling a thing. I haven't gone hiking alone since. A few years ago, I took a seasonal job as a fire lookout in the Pacific Northwest. For those who don't know, this involves living in a small tower on top of a mountain for weeks at a time, watching for smoke. It is a solitary existence. You are miles from the nearest human being, connected to the world only by a radio. My tower was located in a particularly rugged section of the forest. The view was breathtaking during the day, but at night, the tower felt like a glass cage suspended in a black void. It was my second week on the job. A heavy storm had rolled in, bringing thick fog and heavy rain. Visibility was near zero. The wind was howling around the structure, rattling the windows and making the entire tower groan. I was reading a book by lantern light when I heard a metallic clanging sound from the catwalk outside. The catwalk wraps around the exterior of the cabin, railing high. The only way to access it is by climbing 40 feet of wooden stairs. I assumed the wind had blown something loose, maybe the storage box lid or a loose shutter. I put on my coat, grabbed a flashlight, and opened the door to secure whatever was banging. The wind hit me instantly, almost knocking me off balance. I shined my light around the catwalk. The storage box was closed. The shutters were tight. I walked a full circle around the deck, checking everything. There was nothing loose. Confused, I went back inside and locked the door. I sat back down, trying to focus on my book. 10 minutes later, I heard it again. Clang, clang, clang. It was distinct this time. It sounded like someone was running a metal object along the railing of the catwalk. I froze. There shouldn't be anyone up here. The trail to the tower was washed out, and no hikers would be out in a storm like this. I turned off my lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness so I could see out without my reflection blocking the view. I crept to the window and peered out into the storm. At first, I saw nothing but rain lashing against the glass. Then, a bolt of lightning illuminated the sky, and for a split second, the catwalk was lit up. Standing on the railing, pressing their face against the glass of the window directly opposite me, was a man. He was soaking wet, his hair plastered to his skull. His skin was pale, almost gray. He wasn't holding on to the railing for safety. He was gripping the window frame with both hands, staring into the dark cabin. He knew I was in there. I scrambled backward, fumbling for my radio. I tried to call base, but the storm was causing too much interference. All I got was static. I was trapped in a 14 by 14 glass box, 40 feet in the air, with a maniac right outside the door. I grabbed the fire axe kept on the wall for emergencies and retreated to the center of the room. I watched the door handle. It began to jiggle violently. The lock held, but the wood of the door frame creaked under the pressure. The man was throwing his weight against it, trying to break it down. He didn't scream. He didn't demand to be let in. He just slammed his body against the door over and over again with a rhythmic, mechanical persistence. This went on for what felt like an hour. I sat there, axe in hand, praying the hinges wouldn't fail. Then, as abruptly as it started, the pounding stopped. I didn't move. I stayed in that spot until the sun came up and the fog cleared. When morning broke, I cautiously opened the door and looked out. The catwalk was empty. I radioed for help, and a ranger came up later that day. We found muddy boot prints on the stairs, but they were odd. They were barefoot prints. The man had climbed the mountain and the tower in a freezing storm without shoes. We followed the tracks down to the base of the tower, but they disappeared into the dense undergrowth. The rangers searched the area for days but never found anyone. I finished my contract, but I slept with the axe next to my bed every single night until I left. I have a hobby that is technically illegal, but I find it thrilling. I am an urban explorer. I find abandoned buildings, old factories, and forgotten structures to photograph. I have a strict rule: take nothing but pictures, leave nothing but footprints. Last summer, I found a location on an old forum that looked incredible. It was a defunct military research facility deep in the woods of West Virginia. The Post said it had been abandoned since the late 80s. I drove out there on a Saturday. I had to park my car 2 miles away on an old logging road and hike through dense forest to get to the perimeter. The woods were thick and overgrown, reclaiming the land. I eventually reached the perimeter fence. It was 10 feet high, topped with rusted razor wire. No trespassing signs hung every 50 feet, faded and bullet-ridden. I found a section where a tree had fallen and crushed the fence, creating a perfect entry point. I slipped inside. The atmosphere changed immediately. The air felt stagnant. The facility consisted of 3 large concrete buildings, overgrown with vines. I spent a few hours exploring the first 2 buildings. They were typical abandoned spots: peeling paint, rusted filing cabinets, water-damaged floors. It was late afternoon when I entered the third building. This one was different. The doors were heavy steel, and there were no windows. I had to use my high-powered flashlight to navigate. I made my way down to the basement level. It was a maze of long, concrete corridors. As I was photographing an old generator room, I heard a sound that made me lower my camera. It was the sound of a heavy metal door slamming shut somewhere deeper in the facility. I froze. I knew I was the only car parked on the logging road. I hadn't seen any other tracks. I decided it was time to leave. I turned off my flashlight to stay hidden and began navigating back toward the stairs using the dim ambient light coming from the cracks in the ceiling. As I moved silently down the hallway, I saw a light source coming from around the corner ahead of me. It wasn't a flashlight beam. It was the flickering glow of a fire. I pressed myself against the cold concrete wall and peeked around the corner. In the middle of the hallway, someone had built a small fire using broken furniture. Sitting around the fire were 3 men. They weren't security guards, and they weren't other explorers. They were dressed in rags, filthy and emaciated. They were eating something out of tin cans, tearing at the food with their hands. Behind them, lined up against the wall, were backpacks. Dozens of them. Hiking packs, camera bags, camping gear. It was a trophy collection. I realized then that this wasn't just a squatting spot. This was a hunting ground. I slowly pulled my head back, terrified that my breathing would give me away. I began to back up, step by step, trying to reach the emergency stairwell at the other end of the hall. My foot scuffed against a piece of loose gravel. The sound echoed through the concrete corridor like a gunshot. The firelight flickered as shadows moved instantly. I didn't wait to look. I turned and sprinted toward the stairwell. Behind me, I heard a chorus of guttural shouts and the sound of footsteps pounding against the concrete. They were fast. I hit the stairs and took them 3 at a time, risking a broken ankle in the darkness. I burst out of the ground-level door and into the blinding sunlight of the afternoon. I didn't stop. I scrambled through the hole in the fence and sprinted into the woods. I could hear them crashing through the brush behind me, whooping and hollering like animals. I didn't care about the noise anymore. I ran through thorn bushes and creeks, tearing my clothes and skin, fueled purely by adrenaline. I made it to my car, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking so violently I dropped them in the dirt. I heard branches snapping nearby. I snatched the keys up, dove into the car and locked the doors just as a figure emerged from the tree line. He stood at the edge of the woods, watching me as I peeled out of the dirt road. I reported it to the police, giving them the coordinates. They went out there a week later. They told me they found the campsite in the basement, and they found the backpacks. They contained IDs of people who had been reported missing over the last 5 years, but the men were gone. Some places are abandoned for a reason, and some parts of the woods are better left unexplored. If you ever get that feeling that you aren't alone, trust it. Turn around and run. If you have a story, you know where to send it. Stay safe.